The war was dying, but its secrets were being buried alive. In the pre-dawn darkness of May the 8th, 1945, as church bells across Europe prepared to ring out victory, a different sound echoed through the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia. The rhythmic chug of a steam locomotive moving slowly, deliberately, away from the collapsing Reich and towards something else entirely. Something hidden. Local villagers, peering through shuttered windows, watched the train pass. It was longer than usual, heavier than usual, and guarded by SS soldiers who looked more like ghosts than men, hollow-eyed, desperate, clinging to rifles like drowning men to driftwood. The train carried no wounded, no refugees, no military equipment visible from the outside, just sealed boxcars, 23 of them, their contents unknown, but their importance undeniable. By dawn, the train had vanished. By noon, Germany had surrendered. And by the end of that week, when Allied investigators came looking for the train, guided by rumors, whispers, and the frantic testimony of a dying SS officer, they found nothing. No train, no tracks leading anywhere particular, no witnesses willing to talk. The ghost train had disappeared into the earth itself, swallowed by the mountains, carrying with it one of the greatest fortunes in human history. Conservative estimates put the value at 3 billion Reichsmarks in 1945 currency, tens of billions in today's dollars. Gold bars stamped with the eagle and swastika, diamonds pried from the hands of the murdered, art masterpieces cut from their frames, the crystallized suffering of an entire continent, compressed into 23 boxcars. This is the story of that treasure. But more than that, it's the story of the people who hid it, the people who hunted it, and the terrible price paid by those who came too close to the truth. Part 1. The Plunder Machine. To understand the treasure trains, you must first understand the machinery that created them. Nazi Germany didn't just conquer Europe, it ransacked it with industrial efficiency. What began as ideological warfare evolved into the most systematic looting operation in human history, a bureaucratized theft that would have impressed any organized crime syndicate. The architect of this plunder was Hermann Göring, the Reich's second-in-command, a man whose appetites were as legendary as his ego. Göring established the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR, the Special Task Force, whose sole purpose was to identify, catalog, confiscate, and ship cultural treasures back to Germany. They operated like a military unit, sweeping through conquered territories behind the Wehrmacht advance, stripping museums, libraries, churches, and private collections with devastating thoroughness. But Göring's operation was almost genteel compared to what came after. Heinrich Himmler's SS developed a parallel network, one that dealt not in art and culture, but in something more primal: raw wealth, gold, jewelry, currency. The SS plunder operation, known as Aktion Reinhard after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, focused primarily on the death camps. Everything taken from the murdered, gold teeth extracted from corpses, wedding rings, watches, even eyeglasses, was melted down, processed, and shipped to SS headquarters or directly to the Reichsbank. The numbers are staggering and sickening in equal measure. From Auschwitz alone, approximately 8,000 kilograms of gold were extracted from victims. From the Warsaw Ghetto, before its liquidation, Nazi forces confiscated an estimated 1.5 million zlotys in cash, plus uncounted jewelry and valuables. Multiply this across dozens of ghettos and death camps, across 6 years of methodical murder, and you begin to glimpse the scale. By 1943, the Reichsbank's vaults were overflowing. Gold bars stacked floor to ceiling, foreign currency from 20 different countries, bags of diamonds that had once adorned the fingers and necks of Amsterdam's diamond merchants, Prague's jewelers, Paris's nobility. The problem became not how to acquire more wealth, but where to put it all. Enter Albert Speer, and the bunker program. Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, was a pragmatist. By 1944, with Allied bombers turning German cities into rubble, he recognized that surface storage was no longer viable. He initiated an ambitious program to move critical resources underground, not just military production facilities, but also the Reich's accumulated wealth. The Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia offered a perfect solution. The region was honeycombed with old mining tunnels and caves, some dating back centuries. Under the codename Rees Giant, the SS began an extensive tunneling operation using slave labor from the Gross Rosen concentration camp complex. Thousands of prisoners, working in horrific conditions, carved new tunnels and expanded existing ones, creating a subterranean labyrinth designed to outlast the Reich itself. The exact purpose of these tunnels remains debated. Some were clearly weapons production facilities. Others housed communications equipment or served as air raid shelters for high-ranking officials. But several, particularly those with reinforced entrances and specialized security, appear to have been designed as storage vaults. This is where Major Friedrich Steiner enters our story. Part 2, The Keeper of Secrets. Major Friedrich Steiner was not a typical SS officer. Born in 1898 to a Bavarian banking family, he'd served in the First World War as an artillery officer, earning the Iron Cross for valor. After the war, he'd returned to banking, eventually managing one of Munich's most prestigious private banks. When the Nazis came to power, Steiner, like many conservative Germans who should have known better, convinced himself that the new regime would restore order and prosperity. By 1938, his expertise in financial management had caught the attention of SS economic administrators. He was offered a commission with the rank of major, assigned to the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office. His job: oversee the storage and accounting of confiscated assets. Steiner kept meticulous records. Unlike many of his colleagues, who were content with crude estimates and round numbers, he insisted on proper documentation. Every gold bar had a weight, a source, a destination. Every piece of jewelry was photographed and cataloged. Every painting was given a provenance report, even if that provenance was simply confiscated from name deceased. His obsessive record-keeping would later be his curse. By January 1945, with Soviet forces driving westward and American forces crossing the Rhine, Steiner received new orders directly from Himmler's office. He was to oversee the evacuation of the Reichsbank's most valuable holdings from Berlin. The destination: the underground facilities in the Owl Mountains. The operation began on March 1st, 1945. Under cover of darkness, trucks began arriving at the Reichsbank. Workers, a mix of SS personnel and civilian employees sworn to secrecy, loaded crate after crate. The gold alone required 17 trucks. The paper currency, bundled in waterproof containers, filled another 9. Then came the jewelry, the diamonds, the platinum, the silver bars, the foreign gold coins, the looted art too valuable to risk in the main evacuation trains. Everything was loaded onto freight cars at Berlin's Lehrter station. The train, designated Transport 293, was given priority routing and an SS guard detail of 30 men under Steiner's personal command. It departed Berlin on March 15, 1945. As Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, the journey took 6 days, a trip that should have taken 12 hours. Allied air superiority meant traveling only at night, hiding in tunnels during the day, taking circuitous routes through secondary rail lines. But they made it. On March 21st, Transport 293 arrived at the small station of Waldenburg, now Walbrik, Poland, just outside the Owl Mountains. From there, the cargo was transferred to a narrow-gauge railway that ran directly into the mountains. Steiner watched as his carefully cataloged treasure disappeared into the earth, carried on mining cars into tunnels that seemed to swallow light itself. But Transport 293 was just the first. Over the next 6 weeks, as Germany's collapse accelerated, Steiner coordinated the arrival of 7 more trains. Not all came from Berlin. Some originated from Munich, carrying Bavarian state bank reserves. Others came from Vienna, Prague, and even Paris. Late evacuations of regional SS treasuries. Each train was logged in Steiner's records, each cargo inventoried with his characteristic precision. The final train arrived on April 29, 1945. This one was different. It came from Auschwitz. The cargo included the last major shipment from the camp's confiscation operation, evacuated just ahead of the Soviet liberation in January, but held in a secondary facility until the final moment. Gold teeth, melted down jewelry, the last remnants of people who'd been reduced to their market value by an inhuman calculus. Steiner later testified that unloading this particular cargo broke something in it. Until that moment, he'd maintained the psychological fiction that he was simply a financial administrator, no different than a bank manager safeguarding assets. But staring at crate after crate of gold teeth, some still with bits of jawbone attached, the extraction having been rushed, he could no longer maintain the illusion. He was not a banker. He was a gravedigger, inventorying the remains of the murder. That night, April 22, 1945, Major Friedrich Steiner made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He began creating 2 sets of records. The official record, which he would showed only general categories and approximate values, but he also began keeping a private ledger, one with exact locations, precise inventories, and something else: the names. Whenever possible, Steiner recorded the original owners. Gold ring, 18 karat, engraved Miriam and Jacob, 1928. Confiscated Amsterdam, 1943. Painting, oil on canvas, Woman with Lilacs, by Edouard Manet. Seized Rothschild collection, Paris, 1940. He didn't know what he intended to do with these records. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it was simply his banker's soul asserting itself, insisting that even in madness, accounts should balance and debts should be acknowledged. He finished his private ledger on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's surrender. Part 3. The Last Order. The evening of May 7th was unseasonably warm in the Owl Mountains. Steiner had dismissed most of his men, keeping only a skeleton crew of 12 trusted soldiers. They'd been moving the last cargo into the deepest tunnel, Tunnel 7, which penetrated nearly 2 kilometers into the mountain. At 8:47 p.m., a Kubelwagen pulled up to the tunnel entrance. 2 officers emerged: SS Standartenführer Otto Berger and his aide. Berger was Himmler's representative, a true believer who'd spent the war overseeing security at various concentration camps. His presence was not a good sign. "Major Steiner," Berger said, his voice crisp despite the chaos consuming Germany. "The Reichsfuhrer has sent final instructions regarding the secured materials." Steiner's blood ran cold. He knew what final instructions meant in SS parlance. It meant destruction. It meant leaving nothing for the Allies. "The materials are secure, Standartenführer," Steiner replied carefully. "The tunnels are well hidden. There's no need for—" "The Reichsfuhrer's orders are clear," Berger interrupted. "Nothing of value falls into enemy hands. Nothing." He handed Steiner a sealed envelope. "These are the technical specifications. Demolition teams are already en route from Dresden. They'll arrive tomorrow afternoon. You'll assist them in preparing the charges." Steiner opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were blueprints and calculations for a cascading tunnel collapse. The plan called for explosives placed at strategic intervals throughout the tunnel system, designed to bring down millions of tons of rock. Anything inside would be buried forever. "There must be an alternative," Steiner said. "This wealth could—" "Could what?" Berger's eyes were cold. Rebuild the Reich? The Reich is dead, Major. All that remains is denying the enemy their spoils. He paused, studying Steiner with an expression that might have been pity. Or perhaps you're thinking of recovering it yourself after the war. I assure you that's impossible. The explosives will include thermite charges specifically designed to melt the gold into the surrounding rock. A symbolic gesture. Europe's wealth returned to the earth from which it came. After Berger left, Steiner sat in his makeshift office, a converted mine supervisor's shack, staring at the demolition plans. Around him, the mountains held their secrets. Inside those tunnels lay not just gold and art, but evidence. Evidence of crimes that the world was only beginning to comprehend. If he followed orders, that evidence would disappear. The manet stolen from the Rothschilds would never go home. The wedding ring engraved for Miriam and Jakob would never be returned to their descendants. The gold teeth would never testify to the magnitude of the atrocity. But if he didn't follow orders, Berger would simply find someone who would, and Steiner would likely be executed for disobedience. Not an uncommon fate for SS officers in the Reich's final days. When paranoia ran as high as desperation, he made his decision at midnight. Steiner called in his most trusted sergeant, a 40-year-old career soldier named Klaus Richter. Klaus, you have a wife and children in Bavaria, correct? Yes, sir. 3 children. And you'd like to see them again? Very much, sir. Then listen carefully. Steiner pulled out his private ledger and a sealed envelope. In 6 hours, I want you to take 5 men you trust absolutely and load 2 trucks with supplies from our stores. Food, tools, medical equipment, currency. Enough to establish yourselves. Then I want you to drive south through the mountains to Bavaria. Don't stop, don't look back. And above all, don't be here tomorrow afternoon. Sir, that's desertion. That's survival. The war is over, Klaus. Germany has surrendered. They just haven't made the announcement yet. By tomorrow night, this entire area will be crawling with Soviets or Americans. Any soldier found here will either be shot or sent to a prison camp. Steiner pushed the envelope across the desk. This contains papers identifying you and your men as Wehrmacht, not SS. You were separated from your unit during the retreat. You're heading home. Stick to that story. Klaus took the envelope, but didn't leave. What about you, sir? I have one more duty to perform. Steiner tapped his private ledger. Someone needs to ensure that what happened here isn't completely forgotten. Now go, before I change my mind. After Klaus left, Steiner opened his safe and removed 2 items: a Luger pistol and a small leather journal, his private ledger. He studied the pistol for a long moment, then set it aside. Not yet. Instead, he spent the next 3 hours making multiple copies of his ledger's most critical pages, the locations of the major caches, the rough inventories, the names of stolen items, and their original owners. He sealed these copies in waterproof containers, along with photographs he'd secretly taken of some of the more distinctive pieces. At 4 a.m., while his camp slept, Steiner ventured into the tunnels one final time. He knew every meter of this underground labyrinth. He'd spent weeks mapping it, choosing the optimal storage locations, ensuring proper ventilation and humidity control to preserve the art. Now he used that knowledge to hide something else. In Tunnel 3, behind a false wall of stacked crates that looked permanent but could be shifted by one person, he left the first package. In Tunnel 5, inside a ventilation shaft 20 meters above the floor, accessible only if you knew which rusted ladder was still sound, he left the second. The third, he buried in a sealed metal box just outside the entrance to Tunnel 7, beneath a marker only he would recognize. As dawn broke on May 8, 1945, Steiner emerged from the tunnels for the last time. His uniform was filthy with rock dust, his hands bleeding from climbing rough stone. He cleaned up, changed into a fresh uniform, and prepared to meet the demolition team that would seal away billions in treasure. But the demolition team never arrived. Part 4. The Collapse. The demolition team from Dresden didn't arrive because Dresden no longer had demolition teams. By May 8th, Dresden had no organized military units at all. The city was in chaos, its population either dead, fled, or surrendering to approaching Allied forces. Standartenführer Berger didn't know this when he'd issued his orders. By the time he found out, events had overtaken him. Soviet forces, moving faster than intelligence had predicted, reached the Owl Mountains region by midday on May 8. Berger, trying to reach the tunnel complex to ensure his orders were carried out, was captured by a Soviet advance patrol just 15 kilometers from his destination. He would die in a Soviet prison camp in 1947, never having returned to the mountains. Steiner, waiting at the tunnel entrance with his remaining men, heard the surrender announcement on a portable radio at 2:15 p.m. Germany had capitulated unconditionally. The war was over, but Steiner's war was not. At 3:30 p.m., he heard engines approaching, not the expected German trucks, but Soviet tanks. The advance elements of a Red Army unit were pushing through the valley, securing territory before any organized defense could form. Steiner made a split-second decision. He ordered his men to change into civilian clothes, a capital offense under SS regulations. But regulations no longer matter, and scatter into the local population. Most obeyed. Two chose to remain, saying they'd rather take their chances surrendering as soldiers than be shot as deserters. Steiner himself didn't run. Instead, he did something that seemed insane, but was actually calculated. He walked toward the approaching Soviet forces, hands raised, his SS uniform clearly visible. "I am Major Friedrich Steiner," he announced in Russian. He'd learned the language from a Ukrainian mistress before the war. "I have information of value to offer in exchange for consideration." This was a gamble. Summary execution of SS officers was common practice among Soviet forces, who'd seen firsthand what the SS had done in the East. But Steiner was banking on Soviet pragmatism. The Soviets wanted information, resources, anything useful from the collapsed Reich. An SS major offering cooperation might be worth keeping alive, at least temporarily. He was right. The Soviet captain, a veteran named Dmitry Volkov, didn't shoot Steiner. Instead, he had him restrained and brought to the battalion command post, where a political commissar would decide his fate. Steiner spent the next 3 days in a commandeered farmhouse, under guard, waiting. He used this time to craft his story. He would reveal the existence of the treasure, impossible to hide anyway, once the Soviets started exploring the tunnels, but he would understate its value and claim ignorance of specific locations within the tunnel system. He would present himself as a mere accountant, not a willing participant in the SS's crimes. On May 11, he was interrogated by SMERSH, Soviet military counterintelligence. The interrogator, a major named Yuri Petrov, was nobody's fool. "Your SS," Petrov said in German. "SS doesn't handle logistics. SS handles ideological enforcement and special operations. So tell me, Major, which villages did you burn? Which prisoners did you shoot?" "I was SS Economic Administration," Steiner replied carefully. "Banking and asset management. I never served in an operational unit." Petrov slid a photograph across the table. It showed Steiner in full SS uniform, touring what was clearly a concentration camp, with an identifying sign partially visible in the background. "Never served in operational units." This was taken at Gross Rosen, the labor camp whose prisoners dug your precious tunnels. "You were there multiple times. You saw the conditions. You did nothing." Steiner had no answer to that. He simply nodded. "Now," Petrov continued, "you say you have information about stored assets. How much?" "I don't know the exact total. Everything was cataloged, but the records were incomplete, and values fluctuated based on..." "How much?" Petrov's voice was sharp. "Conservative estimate, 3 billion Reichsmarks in gold and currency, perhaps 1 billion more in art and jewelry." Petrov's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. That was an astronomical sum, enough to help rebuild Soviet cities the Germans had destroyed. "And you know where this is located?" "In the tunnels. Yes, but it's extensive. 23 rail cars worth of material, distributed throughout a tunnel system that spans several kilometers. This was Steiner's first lie. He knew exactly where everything was, but he was already planning ahead, trying to preserve some leverage. "You'll show us," Petrov said. It wasn't a question. Over the next week, Steiner led Soviet recovery teams into the tunnels. They found wealth beyond their imagining. Crate after crate of gold bars, stacked like firewood, bags of diamonds that sparkled even in dim flashlight beams, paintings carefully wrapped and stored, currency from a dozen nations. But they didn't find everything. Steiner carefully avoided Tunnel 7, the deepest one, where the most valuable items were stored. He claimed that tunnel was unstable, that a minor collapse had sealed it off during the final days of the war. The Soviet engineers who examined it agreed. The entrance showed signs of rockfall, and without proper equipment, clearing it would be dangerous. "How much was in that tunnel?" Petrov asked. Steiner shrugged. "Mostly paperwork and secondary items. Nothing compared to what you've already recovered." Another lie. Tunnel 7 contained approximately 40% of the total treasure, including virtually all the identifiable pieces. Items with names attached, with histories, with documented theft records. The gold that could potentially be traced back to death camp victims. The art with clear provenance from Jewish collectors. Steiner was keeping that tunnel hidden not for himself, but because he'd already decided those items needed special handling. They were evidence of crimes, not just spoils of war. They deserved to go home, not into Soviet state vaults. By May 20th, the Soviets had recovered an estimated 1.8 billion Reichsmarks in gold and currency, plus uncounted art and jewelry. A staggering haul. Petrov was satisfied. His superiors were satisfied. There was talk of medals, commendations, perhaps even promotions. Steiner had bought himself value as a cooperative prisoner. He was transferred to a more comfortable detention facility, classified as a valuable intelligence asset rather than a war criminal. He would spend the next 3 years in Soviet custody, but he would survive, unlike 90% of SS officers captured in the East. But the story of Tunnel 7 was only beginning. Part 5. The Accountant's Conscience. Soviet prisoner of war camp, Magdeburg, East Germany, September 1947. Friedrich Steiner had aged 20 years in the 2.5 since Germany's surrender. His hair had gone completely white. His hands trembled from malnutrition and untreated stress. The tuberculosis he'd contracted in the camps had left him with a rattling cough that never quite went away. But his mind remained sharp, and his conscience, newly awakened in the war's final days, had become a torment. He'd been moved from camp to camp as Soviet priorities shifted. After his initial usefulness in locating the treasure had been exhausted, he'd been interrogated about SS financial networks, money laundering operations, hidden bank accounts. He'd cooperated as much as he dared without implicating others who might still be alive. Now, in September 1947, he received unexpected news. He was being released. The Soviet system operated on strange logic. War criminals were supposed to be prosecuted, but valuable assets could sometimes be leveraged for political purposes. With tensions growing between the Soviets and the Western Allies, the Cold War was beginning. Though no one used that term yet, there was value in demonstrating magnanimity. Releasing cooperative prisoners showed the Soviets as reasonable victors, not vindictive conquerors. Steiner was given civilian clothes, basic papers identifying him as a former bank clerk, his SS service scrubbed from official records, and a one-way travel permit to Bavaria. He was 49 years old, chronically ill, unemployable due to his wartime service, and penniless. He was also the only person alive who knew the complete truth about Tunnel 7. Sergeant Klaus Richter had survived the war and made it home to Bavaria. Steiner had kept his name out of all interrogations, and Klaus had successfully established himself with his Wehrmacht identity. The two men found each other through careful, coded messages passed through mutual contacts, dangerous communication, in occupied Germany, where both Soviets and Western allies were hunting former SS members. They met in a beer hall in Munich in November 1947. Klaus almost didn't recognize his former commanding officer. "My God, Friedrich, you look like a corpse. I'm told that's an improvement from 6 months ago." Steiner coughed into a handkerchief. "Tell me you still have the papers I gave you." Klaus's expression grew guarded. "Why?" "Because I need to do something with the information before I die." "And Klaus?" "I am dying. The doctors say 6 months, maybe a year. The papers are safe. But Friedrich, if you're thinking of going after the rest of the treasure, I'm not." Steiner pulled out a small notebook. "I've been thinking about this for 2 years. The gold the Soviets took, that's war spoils. The Allies would have taken it too. It'll go to rebuilding something eventually. But the items in Tunnel 7, they're different. They're evidence. Proof of what happened. And some of them have names attached. They can go home." Klaus leaned back, studying his former commander. "You've developed a conscience. That's dangerous for an ex-SS officer." "I never stopped having one. I just learned to ignore it." Steiner's eyes were haunted. "But I can't ignore it anymore. Every night I dream about those crates of gold teeth. Every night I see the engraved rings. Someone's Miriam, someone's Jacob. They're dead, Klaus. We can't bring them back. But we can return their things to their families, and in the process, likely get arrested and hanged as a war criminal. I'm dying anyway, but you don't have to be involved. Just give me my papers back." Klaus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'll contact the Jewish restitution organizations, the ones working on returning looted assets. I'll give them the information, the location of Tunnel 7, the rough inventory, the names I recorded, anonymous information. They can pass it to the appropriate authorities. The Soviets control that territory, I know, which makes it complicated. But in time, things might change. Germany won't stay divided forever, and even if it does, even if that tunnel stays sealed for 50 years, at least the information will exist. Families will know their relatives' possessions are documented somewhere. That matters. It's a long shot, Friedrich. Everything is a long shot now. But it's the only shot those people have at recovering any connection to the dead." Over the next 3 months, Steiner made contact with the Jewish Restitution Commission through a series of careful intermediaries. He couldn't meet with them directly. His SS past, if discovered, would destroy any credibility. Instead, he worked through Klaus, who claimed to be representing an anonymous source within the former SS, who wished to make amends. The commission was understandably skeptical. They'd been flooded with claims, rumors, and outright cons from people hoping to profit from the chaos of post-war restitution. But Steiner's information was different. The level of detail was extraordinary. The documentation was precise. The man clearly had inside knowledge. In January 1948, representatives of the commission met with Klaus in a secure location. He provided them with copies of Steiner's partial ledger, enough to prove credibility without revealing everything. He described the location of Tunnel 7 in general terms, and he explained why it couldn't currently be accessed. "The entrance is blocked," Klaus said. "Natural collapse, possibly accelerated by Soviet recovery operations in adjacent tunnels. The entire area is in the Soviet occupation zone. Any attempt to reach it would require official cooperation from Soviet authorities." The commission representative, a survivor named David Rosenberg, who'd lost his entire family at Treblinka, examined the documents with shaking hands. "These items, my God, this painting here, woman with lilacs, that belonged to my wife's family. It hung in their home in Paris. I thought it was lost forever. It's in Tunnel 7, Klaus confirmed. Wrapped in waterproof cloth, stored in a wooden crate, marked E47. At least it was there in May 1945. We can't guarantee current condition." Rosenberg looked up with tears in his eyes. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Klaus glanced away. "Because someone should." The commission wanted to move immediately, but Klaus explained the practical impossibilities. The Cold War was deepening. The Soviets weren't cooperating with Western restitution efforts. Attempting to dig into a sealed tunnel in Soviet-controlled territory would be seen as espionage. "Then what do we do?" Rosenberg asked. "You wait," Klaus said quietly. "You document everything. You keep the records safe, and you wait for the political situation to change. It might take years. It might take decades, but eventually that tunnel will become accessible. And when it does, you'll know exactly what to look for." Period. The commission agreed. They cataloged all of Steiner's information, cross-referenced it with their own records of looted items, and filed it away. A time capsule of theft waiting for redemption. Friedrich Steiner died on July 3, 1948. Klaus Richter was at his bedside. Steiner's last words were, "Did we do enough?" Klaus didn't know how to answer that, so he simply held his friend's hand until the end. Part 6. The Treasure Hunters. The post-war years saw a peculiar industry emerge. Treasure hunting. Former German soldiers, displaced persons, opportunists, and genuine historians all converged on areas rumored to contain Nazi loot. The Owl Mountains, given their documented use by the SS in the war's final days, became a particular focus. Some of these treasure hunters were sincere. Others were crackpots. A few were dangerous. In 1958, a former German engineer named Heinrich Müller, no relation to the Gestapo chief, claimed he had maps showing the exact location of sealed treasure tunnels in the Owl Mountains. He'd supposedly obtained these maps from an SS officer he'd worked with during the war. Müller sold shares in his treasure recovery company to investors throughout West Germany, raising over 200,000 Deutschmarks. The only problem, his maps were complete fabrications. Müller spent 2 years conducting elaborate excavations that yielded nothing but holes in the ground and mounting debts. When creditors finally caught up with him in 1960, he was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 4 years in prison. His maps, examined by genuine experts, showed tunnel configurations that were physically impossible and locations that didn't match any known German wartime construction. But Müller's fraud had an unexpected consequence. It made legitimate researchers' jobs harder. Every claim about Nazi treasure now carried the stink of con artistry. Even the Jewish Restitution Commission's carefully documented information was viewed with skepticism by Polish authorities who controlled the area. The Poles had their own complicated relationship with the treasure story. After the war, the Owl Mountains region, now Polish territory, its German population expelled, became a site of intense interest for the communist government. The Soviets had already removed the most obvious treasures in 1945, but rumors persisted that more remained hidden. Between 1948 and 1965, Polish authorities conducted sporadic explorations of the tunnel systems. They found some remnants, empty crates, discarded paperwork, evidence that the tunnels had indeed been used for storage. But they found no major caches of treasure. The report from 1965 concluded that either the treasure stories were exaggerated or the Soviets had been more thorough than anyone realized. Tunnel 7 was never mentioned in any of these explorations. The entrance remained blocked, and the Polish investigators, lacking detailed maps of the complete tunnel system, never realized it existed. But Klaus Richter never forgot. Now in his 60s, living a quiet life as a postal worker in Bavaria, Klaus maintained contact with the Jewish Restitution Commission. Every year, he sent a brief letter updating his contact information, confirming he was still alive, still willing to help if circumstances changed. In 1971, something changed. The period of détente between East and West opened new possibilities for cross-border cooperation. More importantly, Poland began looking for ways to improve relations with international Jewish organizations. As part of a broader diplomatic strategy, the idea of cooperating on Holocaust restitution, returning stolen property to victims' families, became politically feasible for the first time since the war. David Rosenberg, now director of the Restitution Commission and in his 70s, saw an opportunity. He reached out to Polish authorities through diplomatic channels, explaining that the commission had documentation of items stored in the Owl Mountains that rightfully belonged to Holocaust victims and their descendants. The Poles were intrigued, but cautious. What kind of documentation? Rosenberg provided a carefully edited version of Steiner's ledgers, enough to prove credibility without revealing everything. He described Tunnel 7 only in general terms, saying the information came from wartime sources, without elaborating. To everyone's surprise, the Poles agreed to allow an investigation. Part 7. Return to the Mountain. Owl Mountains, Poland, June 1972. The team that assembled at the base of the mountains was an odd assortment. Polish government officials, representatives from the Jewish Restitution Commission, historians, a mining engineer, and, though no one publicly acknowledged it, Klaus Richter, traveling under his civilian identity, with papers that made no mention of his wartime service. Klaus was 70 now. His memories of May 1945, worn smooth by time, but still intact. As the group discussed strategy, he remained mostly silent, listening, observing. Only when they began debating the tunnel locations did he finally speak. "Excuse me," he said quietly in German, which was translated for the Polish officials, "but you're looking in the wrong area." "What do you mean?" asked Dr. Wojciech Kowalski, the Polish historian leading the expedition. Klaus pulled out a hand-drawn map, not Steiner's original, but a reconstruction he'd made from memory decades ago. "The main tunnel complex extends much further east than your charts show. There's an entire section, at least 3 major tunnels, that wasn't included in the Soviet or Polish surveys." Kowalski studied the maps skeptically. "And you know this? How?" "I was here during the war." Labor supervisor. The lie came smooth. Klaus had been practicing it for 27 years. "I worked with the mining crews. This section here," he pointed, "was sealed off after a methane leak. Dangerous work. We lost 11 men. The SS decided it wasn't worth the risk and focused on other tunnels." "But why would valuable items be stored in a dangerous tunnel?" "They wouldn't. Not at first. But in the final days, when Soviet forces were approaching, the SS was desperate. They needed somewhere to hide the most sensitive items quickly. A sealed-off tunnel that wasn't on the main maps? Perfect hiding spot." The mining engineer, a practical man named Thomas Nowak, examined Klaus's map. "This configuration is consistent with the geology. And see here." He pointed to contour lines on an official survey map. "There's an anomaly in the rock density in this area. Could be natural variation, or it could be a void space." Kowalski remained unconvinced, but agreed to investigate. After all, they'd come this far. The expedition spent 3 days establishing a base camp and securing necessary equipment. Modern technology made the work easier than it would have been in 1945. Portable generators for lighting, electric drills for core sampling, even a basic ground-penetrating radar unit borrowed from an oil exploration company. On the 4th day, they found the entrance to Tunnel 7. It was exactly where Klaus said it would be, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but wasn't. Klaus and Steiner had deliberately arranged loose rock to conceal the entrance back in 1945, knowing the Soviets were coming. The collapse that had supposedly sealed it was nothing more than a few tons of carefully stacked stone that could be cleared with a few hours of work. "Remarkable," Kowalski said, watching his workers remove the debris. "Your memory is excellent for events that occurred nearly 30 years ago." Klaus simply shrugged. "Some things you don't forget." As the entrance cleared, a cool draft emerged from the darkness beyond, air that had been trapped for nearly 3 decades. The team prepared to enter, but Nowak insisted on air quality testing first. There could be toxic gases, oxygen depletion, structural instability. The tests came back positive. The tunnel was safe. The first team to enter consisted of Nowak, Kowalski, Rosenberg, a photographer, and Klaus. They wore hard hats with mounted lights and carried portable lanterns for backup. The tunnel stretched ahead, perfectly dry despite the decades, preserved by the mountain's natural ceiling. 20 meters in, they found the first crate. It was wooden, stenciled with German markings. KG7, silver, 150 kilograms. Klaus recognized the code immediately. KG stood for Kunstgegenstände, art objects, but the weight marking suggested something denser. Nowak carefully pried open the crate. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were silver bars, not industrial silver, but ornate pieces that had clearly been melted down from ceremonial objects, candlesticks, menorahs, Torah decorations. The pieces bore the irregular shapes of hasty melting, still showing fragments of decorative elements that hadn't fully liquefied. Rosenberg's hand trembled as he touched one of the bars. He didn't need to ask where these had come from. The synagogues of Poland, the Jewish communities that no longer existed. There's more, Klaus said quietly, pointing deeper into the tunnel. They found 23 crates in the first chamber alone. Gold bars, each stamped with Nazi insignia and serial numbers. Bags of diamonds that glittered in the lamplight like captured stars. Bundles of currency, Swiss francs, American dollars, British pounds, carefully wrapped in waterproof paper that had done its job perfectly. But it was the second chamber that broke something in all of them. The crates here were smaller, more numerous. Inside the first one they opened, jewelry, rings, necklaces, bracelets, all dumped together in a way that suggested haste. But these weren't the anonymous pieces they'd expected. Many were engraved, "To Sarah, my beloved wife." Benjamin's bar mitzvah, 1938. Rebecca and David, together forever. Rosenberg sat down heavily on a crate, tears streaming down his face. "We found them. My God, we actually found them." The photographer documented everything. Each crate, each item, the serial numbers on the gold bars that might trace them back to specific sources, the engravings on jewelry pieces that could potentially reunite them with families. In the third chamber, they found what Steiner had described as the most valuable items. The art. Paintings were wrapped in cloth and stored in specially constructed wooden frames designed to prevent warping. The first one they uncovered was a small oil painting, a domestic scene, a woman arranging flowers in a vase. The artist's signature was clearly visible. A Manet. "The Rothschild collection," Rosenberg whispered. "This was stolen from the Rothschild mansion in Paris in 1940. It's been missing for 32 years. They found 17 more paintings in that chamber. 2 Rembrandts, a Vermeer that had been considered lost forever, multiple Impressionist works from private Jewish collections across Europe. Each one was carefully wrapped, meticulously stored, preserved as if whoever placed them there actually cared about their survival. Because Steiner had cared. Whatever else he'd been, SS officer, participant in the Nazi system, accomplice to theft. By the end, he'd cared enough to preserve these items properly, not for himself, for the people they'd been stolen from. At the very back of Tunnel 7, in a fourth chamber so deep, it felt like they descended into the Earth's core, they found Steiner's ledgers, not copies, the originals, wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof cloth and sealed in a metal box that had kept them perfectly dry. Steiner's meticulous records documented everything. The source of each item, the original owners, when known, the dates of confiscation, the transportation routes, everything, including something no one had expected, a letter. Klaus recognized the handwriting immediately. Part 8. The Confession. Steiner's letter was dated May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's surrender. It was written in precise German, the hands steady, despite what must have been tremendous stress. Klaus read it aloud, translating for those who didn't speak German. "To whoever finds this, I am SS Major Friedrich Steiner, currently assigned to oversee the storage of confiscated assets in the Owl Mountains facility. By the time you read this, I will likely be dead, either killed in the war's final days executed by my own side for what I am about to do, or tried and hanged by the Allies for what I have already done. I do not write this letter seeking forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I was not ignorant of the crimes being committed. I saw the conditions at Gross Rosen. I knew where the gold teeth came from. I knew what resettlement meant. I knew, and I did nothing to stop it. I told myself I was simply an administrator, a banker following orders. That lie became impossible to maintain. But while I cannot undo what has been done, I can perhaps make one small gesture toward justice. This tunnel contains items stolen from Jewish families across Europe. Much of it came from people who were murdered. Some came from communities that no longer exist. All of it represents lives destroyed by the regime I serve. I have documented everything to the best of my ability. Each item's source, each original owner, when records existed. I have included photographs where possible. These items should be returned to their rightful owners or their descendants. Where no owners can be found, I believe they should be used to support the survivors of our crimes. I expect the immediate future will be chaotic. This tunnel may not be accessed for years, perhaps decades, but I am sealing these records here with the items themselves, in the hope that eventually, when sanity returns, someone will find them and do what I failed to do. Make things right. I make no excuses for my actions. I participated in the greatest crime in human history, but at least I can ensure that some evidence survives. At least I can make sure that the names are remembered. Miriam and Jacob, whose rings are in crate J23, the Rothschild family, whose paintings are in crate E47, the Jewish communities of Amsterdam, Prague, Paris, and 100 other places, whose silver is melted down in crates S1 through S19. They deserved to live. They deserved to keep their possessions. They deserved a world that did not turn on them with such viciousness. I cannot give them any of that, but I can at least ensure that their property is documented, that their names are recorded, that when the world is ready to reckon with what we did, the evidence will be here. If you are reading this, you are likely part of that reckoning. I hope you handle these items with more care and humanity than I showed their original owners. Friedrich Steiner, May 7, 1945. The silence in the tunnel, after Klaus finished reading, was absolute. Kowalski spoke first. He knew everything, and continued serving. Yes, Rosenberg said quietly, but at the end, he tried to make it mean something. That doesn't excuse anything, but it means we have records. It means we can return these items. Some items, the photographer corrected. How many of these families do you think survive? How many have living descendants who can be found? It was a harsh question, but an honest one. Over the next 6 weeks, a larger team excavated the entire contents of Tunnel 7, under international supervision. The Polish government, to its credit, cooperated fully. The items were catalogued, photographed, and prepared for transport to a secure facility where experts could analyze them and begin the restitution process. The final inventory was staggering. 847 gold bars, total weight approximately 3,200 kilograms, 127 crates of melted silver from religious objects, 1,483 pieces of documented jewelry with engravings or identifying marks, 34 paintings by recognized masters, 473 other artworks, sculptures, drawings, decorative objects, 28 Torah scrolls, damaged but potentially restorable, 6 million Swiss francs in currency, 2 million American dollars in currency, various other currencies totaling approximately 800,000 pounds sterling. But more valuable than any of these items were Steiner's ledgers, the documentation, the names. The restitution process took decades. Some items were returned to families who'd assumed them lost forever. A woman in New York received her grandmother's wedding ring, engraved with Hebrew letters, that had been stripped from her in Auschwitz. A family in Israel recovered a painting that had hung in their Paris apartment before the occupation. A synagogue in London was given back its Torah scroll, confiscated in 1943. But for every successful return, there were a dozen failures. Families completely exterminated. No descendants to claim the property. Items whose original owners could never be identified. Despite Steiner's documentation, the records had been incomplete, or names had been misspelled, or the original confiscation had been too chaotic to track properly. These unclaimed items became the foundation for the Steiner Memorial Fund. Established in 1975, the fund supported Holocaust education, survivor assistance, and historical research. It was a bitter irony. Treasures stolen from murdered Jews now being used to remember them. But it was something. Klaus Richter died in 1979, having seen Tunnel 7 emptied and its contents beginning their journey home. He never publicly acknowledged his SS service or his role in the story. He remained, officially, a former Wehrmacht sergeant who'd happened to work in the area and remembered the tunnels. But David Rosenberg knew the truth. At Klaus's funeral, a small affair attended mostly by family, Rosenberg gave a eulogy that puzzled most of the attendees. This man carried a burden for 34 years. He kept faith with a friend's dying wish. He helped return stolen property to people he'd never met, seeking nothing for himself. Whatever else he may have been, whatever he may have done in the war, he spent the last third of his life trying to make something right. That deserves to be remembered. After the funeral, Rosenberg burned the documents that identified Klaus as former SS. There was no point in tarnishing the man's memory now. He'd done his penance. He'd helped hundreds of families recover pieces of their past. That would have to be enough. Part 9. The Phantom Train. But Tunnel 7 wasn't the only story. In 1981, a researcher named Helena Kowalski, no relation to the historian, was examining Polish railway records from The record showed a train, Transport 293, Steiner's first shipment from Berlin, arriving at Waldenburg on March 21, 1945. But there was no corresponding record of it being unloaded or continuing to another destination. The train had simply disappeared from the records. Kowalski spent 3 years investigating. She interviewed elderly railway workers who'd been present in 1945. She examined Soviet records that had been recently declassified. She traced transport manifests and maintenance logs. Her conclusion, published in 1984, was startling. Transport 293 had never been fully unloaded. According to her research, the train had arrived during an air raid. The unloading was interrupted when Allied bombers struck the railway junction. Most of the cargo was removed, but at least 3 cars, possibly more, had been shunted onto a siding and forgotten in the chaos of the war's final weeks. When Soviet forces arrived, they'd focused on the obvious storage facilities, the tunnels. No one thought to systematically search the rail yards for abandoned freight cars. And by the time anyone thought to check, the cars had been mixed in with hundreds of other abandoned rolling stock, their contents unknown, their origin forgot. The treasure in Tunnel 7 was substantial, Kowalski wrote, but it may represent only 70 to 80% of what was originally transported to the Owl Mountains. The remainder, possibly as much as 1 billion Reichsmarks in value, could still be sitting in a forgotten railway car somewhere in what was once the Waldenburg Junction. The Polish government investigated her claims in 1985. They found the Waldenburg rail yards, now part of a small freight depot, still contained dozens of abandoned World War II-era freight cars. Most were empty or contained only debris, but 3 cars were sealed and locked, their contents unknown. When these cars were finally opened in 1986, they contained empty crates with German military markings, discarded packing materials, 1 crate containing various documents and paperwork, and nothing else. The cars had been looted, whether by Soviet forces, Polish workers, or opportunistic thieves was impossible to determine. Whatever treasure they'd contained was long gone, or was it? The documents found in the last car included a partial manifest, dated April 1945, listing the contents of freight car number 29317. According to the manifest, this car had contained 47 wooden crates marked Art, 12 metal containers marked Documents Classified, 6 cases marked Reichsbank, Special Handling. None of these items were found in the car. A new mystery emerged. If the car had been looted, where did the contents go? If they'd been sold on the black market, surely some would have surfaced by now. Major artworks don't disappear forever. Gold gets melted down and resold. Documents get leaked. But nothing appeared. No deathbed confessions from former Soviet soldiers. No mysterious art pieces turning up at auction. No classified documents revealing SS secrets. It was as if the contents of freight car 293-17 had vanished into thin air. Part 10. The Hunters Return. The discovery of Tunnel 7 and the mystery of the missing freight car sparked renewed interest in Nazi treasure. By the 1990s, with the Cold War ended and Eastern Europe opening up, a new generation of treasure hunters descended on the Owl Mountains. Most were legitimate historians and archaeologists, conducting careful research into wartime activities. But some were adventurers, mystics, and outright con artists. In 1997, 2 men, Polish businessmen Piotr Koper and German amateur historian Andreas Richter, no relation to Klaus, announced they'd found the legendary Nazi gold train. According to their claim, ground-penetrating radar had revealed the train was approximately 100 meters long, consistent with wartime freight trains, and appeared to contain numerous metal objects that could be gold bars or other valuables. The announcement caused a sensation. Media outlets worldwide covered the story. Treasure hunters and history buffs flooded the area. The Polish government, mindful of the chaos, declared the alleged site a protected zone and banned unauthorized excavation. Koper and Richter hired lawyers and claimed rights to any treasure found, citing Polish laws about historical discoveries. The government countered that any Nazi-looted property belonged to the state and would be subject to restitution claims. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years, while experts debated whether the radar. In 1999, the Polish government finally authorized a limited excavation at the site. They found nothing. No train, no tunnel, no treasure. The radar anomalies turned out to be natural rock formations and old mining shafts that created confusing images. Koper and Richter's discovery was either an honest mistake based on misinterpreted data or an elaborate hoax designed to generate publicity and investment. The embarrassment cooled treasure hunting enthusiasm for several years, but the legend refused to die because Steiner's ledgers, now preserved in archives in Jerusalem and Warsaw, contained a tantalizing detail that most people overlooked. The inventory for Tunnel 7 showed it contained approximately 75% of Transport 293's original cargo, plus selected items from later transports, which meant 25% of Transport 293's cargo had never been accounted for. That missing 25% represented roughly 800 million Reichsmarks in 1945 currency, billions in modern value. More importantly, Steiner's notes suggested this missing cargo included some of the most sensitive items: SS documents detailing confiscation operations, lists of collaborators and informants, and financial records showing where money was laundered through neutral countries. These documents would be explosive even today. They would reveal which Swiss banks accepted Nazi gold, which Spanish firms traded with the Reich, which Swedish companies supplied materials, which American businesses maintained relations. Part 11. The Journalist. Warsaw, Poland, 2003. Sarah Markowitz was a third-generation Holocaust survivor. Her great-grandparents had died in Treblinka. Her grandmother had survived Auschwitz. Her mother had been born in a displaced persons camp in 1946. Sarah had grown up with the shadows of that history, but also with a determination to document it. She'd become an investigative journalist, specializing in World War II history and restitution issues. When she heard about the continuing mystery of the missing Nazi treasure, she saw not just a story, but a personal mission. Sarah spent 6 months in archives across Europe, piecing together fragments, railway records, Soviet occupation reports, testimonies from former railway workers, financial documents from post-war restitution claims. She interviewed elderly survivors who'd been in the area in 1945. She hired a geologist to analyze the Owl Mountains tunnel systems. What she discovered was that Kowalski's 1984 theory about the unloaded freight cars was only partially correct. Yes, some cargo had been left in rail cars, but there was also evidence of a separate transport that had never been documented in any official records. According to testimony from a former Polish railway worker she interviewed in 2003, a man then 88 years old, there had been one final train movement on the night of May 7th through 8th, 1945, just hours before Germany's surrender. I was working the night shift, the man told Sarah. Around midnight, an SS officer arrived with maybe 20 soldiers. They commandeered a switching locomotive and attached 4 freight cars. These cars had been sitting on a siding for weeks. We thought they were empty, but they weren't. We could tell by how the locomotive strained. Those cars were heavy. Where did they take them? Sarah asked. South, into the mountains. There's a spur line that goes to an old copper mine. It hasn't been used since before the war. That's the last I saw of them. The next morning, Germany surrendered, and by afternoon, Soviet soldiers were everywhere. The SS were gone. The train was gone. I never saw any of those men again. Sarah located the old copper mine. It was now within a nature preserve, its entrance sealed decades ago for safety reasons. According to geological surveys, the mine had extensive underground workings that connected to natural cave systems, potentially providing access to areas far beyond the original mining operations. She applied for permission to explore the site. The Polish authorities, still sensitive about treasure hunting after the 1999 fiasco, were initially reluctant. But Sarah wasn't some adventurer looking for gold. She was a credentialed journalist with academic backing and legitimate historical questions. Permission was granted in late 2003. The exploration team entered the copper mine in January 2004. The main shaft descended 200 meters into the mountain, then branched into multiple tunnels. Most showed evidence of old mining operations, tool marks, support timbers, remnants of rail tracks for ore cars. But one tunnel was different. This tunnel had been modified more recently. The support structures were steel, not timber, consistent with 1940s construction. The tunnel descended deeper, past the copper-bearing strata, into solid rock. There was no mining reason to dig here. This tunnel had been created for storage. At the end of this tunnel, 380 meters from the entrance, they found a cavern, and in the cavern, they found 4 freight cars. The cars had been painstakingly lowered down the mine shaft in pieces, then reassembled underground, an enormous undertaking that would have required days of work by skilled engineers and laborers. The cars were sealed, locked, and surprisingly well preserved by the dry cave environment. Sarah's hands shook as she helped break the seals on the first car. Inside, they found crates. Not the wooden crates from Tunnel 7, but metal containers designed for long-term storage. The first one they opened contained documents, thousands of pages of SS files, financial records, confiscation reports. The second car contained more documents, plus microfilm reels, copies of records that someone had carefully archived. The third car held a surprise. Gold bars, but not many, only 47 bars. Total weight, about 600 kilograms. Significant, but nowhere near the massive quantities from Tunnel 7. The fourth car contained the real treasure. Art, not the famous masterpieces. Those had gone to Tunnel 7, but this car held items that were, in some ways, more precious. Personal effects, photo albums from Jewish families, religious items, siddurim, prayer shawls, kiddush cups, children's toys, wedding dresses, the mundane objects that make up a life, carefully packed and stored. Why would the SS preserve these items? Why transport them hundreds of meters underground in the war's final hours? The answer was in a letter found in the last crate, written in Steiner's familiar hand, but dated May 8, 1945, the day after his Tunnel 7 letter. I managed to convince the evacuation detail to make one final transport. I told them we were securing the most sensitive SS documents before Soviet arrival. This was partially true, but I also included everything I could save from the personal effects that had been cataloged for disposal. These items have no monetary value. They won't fund any restitution claims or rebuild any communities, but they are proof that these people existed. They are evidence of lives lived before they were taken. The Einsatzgruppen reports in this cache will horrify whoever reads them. The confiscation records will reveal the scope of our crimes. The financial documents will show which institutions benefited from our theft. Let it all be found. Let it all be known. But among those horrors, I hope whoever finds this will also see the photo albums, the children's drawings, the love letters. I hope you will see that we didn't just murder anonymous millions. We murdered individuals, people with names, families, dreams, favorite foods, bad jokes, songs they sang their children. I don't know if keeping these items makes me better or worse. I participated in their theft. I cannot return them to their owners because their owners are dead, killed by the regime I serve, but I can ensure they aren't lost forever. This is probably my last act. The Soviets will be here within hours. I don't expect to survive what comes next. If I do survive, I will likely be executed for war crimes. Either way, this is my final accounting. Everything is here. Everything I could save. Everything I could document. May someone wiser than I was know what to do with it. Friedrich Steiner, May 8, 1945, 11:47 a.m. But Steiner had survived. He'd been captured, interrogated, imprisoned, and eventually released. Why hadn't he revealed this final cache? The answer, Sarah realized, was simple. By the time Steiner was released in 1947, he'd already given the Soviets everything they wanted from Tunnel 7. Revealing another cache would have meant more interrogations, more imprisonment, more years lost. And unlike Tunnel 7, which contained items that could be returned to survivors, this cache was different. These were items too personal, too painful, representing people who'd left no one behind to claim them. Steiner had chosen to let them rest, to let them remain hidden until a time when they could be treated with dignity rather than processed as inventory. That time had finally come. Part 12, The Reckoning. The discovery of what became known as the Steiner cache in 2004 led to a complete reassessment of Nazi looting operations and their aftermath. The SS documents found in the freight cars were devastating. They included complete records of Action Reinhard, detailing the financial processing of death camp victims' property, lists of banks in neutral countries that had accepted deposits of looted gold, including specific account numbers, names of SS officers, German businessmen, and foreign collaborators involved in looting operations. Financial trails showing how stolen art was laundered through auction houses in Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina. These documents led to legal actions against banks that had never properly settled Holocaust-related claims. They revealed previously unknown collaborators. They provided evidence for new restitution cases 70 years after the fact. But the personal items were what captured public attention. The photo albums, carefully preserved, showed ordinary lives. A family celebrating Hanukkah in Berlin, 1936. A young couple's wedding in Vienna, 1938. Children playing in a Prague courtyard, 1939. School photos, bar mitzvah celebrations, summer vacations. The visual record of a world that had been destroyed. Sarah Markowitz worked with historians and archivists to identify as many people in the photographs as possible. Using facial recognition software, genealogical databases, and survivor testimony, they managed to identify nearly 400 individuals. Most had been killed in the Holocaust. But in some cases, they found relatives, children who'd been sent away before the deportations, siblings who'd emigrated earlier, distant cousins who'd survived. These relatives were contacted and offered the opportunity to claim their family's items. One case particularly moved Sarah. She found photos of a family named Rosenblum from Warsaw. The photos showed parents, 3 children, and an older couple, presumably grandparents. All had been killed in Treblinka in 1942. But Sarah's research revealed that the Rosenblums had sent their youngest daughter, Rachel, to Palestine in 1938 as part of a youth group. Rachel had survived, married, raised a family in Israel. She was still alive in 2004, aged 79. When Sarah contacted her and explained what had been found, Rachel was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I have 3 photographs of my family. 3. My entire childhood. My parents, my grandparents, my brother and sisters, reduced to 3 photographs that I managed to save when I left. You're telling me there's a whole album?" The album was returned to her in a ceremony in Jerusalem. It contained 127 photographs spanning 1925 to 1938. Rachel saw her mother at her age, saw her siblings as children, saw her grandfather, whom she barely remembered. She saw herself as a young girl before the world fell apart. "This is more than photographs," Rachel told reporters. "This is proof that we existed, that we were happy once, that we were a normal family who celebrated birthdays and went to the beach and made funny faces at the camera." The Nazis couldn't take that away from us completely. Somehow, impossibly, this survived. Similar reunions played out across the world as items from the Steiner cache were returned. A prayer shawl given to a man in Australia who'd been bar mitzvahed in 1936 and assumed every trace of that day had been destroyed. A wedding dress returned to a woman in America whose mother had worn it 65 years earlier before disappearing into Auschwitz. A child's stuffed bear, threadbare and faded, given to a man in his 80s who remembered losing it when his family was deported from Budapest. These items had negligible monetary value, but their emotional value was incalculable. Not everyone was pleased by the discoveries, however. The financial documents revealed uncomfortable truths about post-war dealings. Banks that had claimed ignorance of Nazi gold sources were proven to have had detailed knowledge. Companies that had denied wartime collaboration were shown to have actively sought German business. Individuals who'd presented themselves as victims or resistors were revealed as collaborators or profiteers. Legal battles erupted. Some banks settled quickly, preferring to pay compensation rather than face continued exposure. Others fought, arguing that the statute of limitations had long since expired, that post-war treaties had resolved all claims, that they couldn't be held responsible for actions taken under duress. The courts generally sided with the claimants. The logic was simple: stolen property remains stolen property, regardless of how much time passes. If you possess stolen goods, you must return them or compensate the rightful owners, no matter when the theft occurred. By 2010, over $800 million in additional compensation had been paid out based on evidence from the Steiner cache. But money wasn't the point. Not really. The point was acknowledgement. The point was forcing institutions to confront their pasts, to admit their complicity, to recognize that the Holocaust wasn't just something that happened, but something that many had profited from. Sarah Markowitz won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the discovery, but she remained focused on the human stories. In 2007, she published a book, The Accountant's Burden, Friedrich Steiner and the Hidden Treasury. The book was controversial. It neither condemned Steiner completely nor celebrated him as a hero. Instead, it presented him as a complicated man who'd participated in evil but eventually tried to document it, preserve evidence, and enable some measure of justice. We want our villains to be villains and our heroes to be heroes, Sarah wrote in the introduction. Steiner was neither. He was a bureaucrat who enabled genocide by making it efficient, then tried to undo some of the harm by keeping meticulous records. He deserves no forgiveness for his crimes, but he also deserves some acknowledgement for his final actions. The world is not simple, neither was he. The book generated intense debate. Holocaust survivors were divided. Some appreciated the nuanced portrayal. Others felt it was too sympathetic to an SS officer. Historians argued about Steiner's motivations. Ethicists debated whether late-life efforts at restitution could ever balance earlier participation in atrocities. But everyone agreed on one thing. Without Steiner's obsessive record-keeping, thousands of items would never have been returned. Hundreds of families would never have recovered pieces of their past, and the full scope of Nazi financial crimes might never have been revealed. Epilogue. What remains? Owl Mountains, Poland. Present day. The treasure trains are gone now. The gold has been melted down or distributed. The art has been returned to museums or families. The documents have been archived. The personal items have found their way home or been donated to Holocaust museums. But questions remain. Steiner's ledgers mention 9 separate transports to the Owl Mountains. Only 8 have been fully accounted for. Transport 294, which supposedly departed Berlin on March 22, 1945, appears in his notes, but was never found in either Tunnel 7 or the copper mine cache. Did it exist? If so, where is it? Some researchers believe Transport 294 never actually left Berlin, that Soviet forces captured it before it could depart, and its contents went to Moscow, where they remain in secret archives. Others think the train was destroyed by Allied bombing en route. A few believe it's still out there somewhere, buried in an undiscovered tunnel or sealed in a forgotten mine shaft. In 2019, a team using modern LiDAR technology mapped the Owl Mountains tunnel systems in unprecedented detail. They found 17 previously unknown tunnels and chambers. Most were empty, but in 3 cases, they found collapsed entrances that would require major excavation to explore. The Polish government, learning from past mistakes, has not authorized treasure hunters to investigate these sites. Instead, they've declared them protected historical sites, to be explored only under strict archaeological supervision when funding and expertise allow. But the legend persists. Every few years, someone announces they've found the real Nazi gold train. Usually, these claims evaporate upon investigation, but occasionally, something genuine emerges. A small cache of documents in a farmhouse attic, a few gold coins buried in a garden, a painting hidden behind a false wall. The treasure isn't gone. It's scattered, dispersed across Europe by theft, chaos, and 7 decades of movement. Some of it sits in private collections, owned by people who have no idea their Vermeer sketch or Baroque silver candelabra was stolen from a murdered family. Some was sold through black markets and laundered so thoroughly that its origin can never be proven. Some genuinely remains hid, waiting in sealed tunnels or buried caches, known only to people now dead. And some, perhaps the most important pieces, were never about monetary value at all. Part 13. The Inheritance. Jerusalem, Israel, 2019, Rachel Rosenblum died at the age of 94, surrounded by 3 generations of descendants who existed only because she'd been sent away from Warsaw in 1938. At her funeral, her grandson spoke about the photo album. "For 70 years, my grandmother lived with 3 photographs," he said. 3 images to remember her entire family. 3 glimpses of a life that was taken from her. She never stopped missing them. Never stopped wondering what happened in those final moments. Never stopped feeling guilty that she survived when they didn't. Then, 15 years ago, she got back a piece of her past. Not just photographs, but memories. Evidence that her family had been real, had been happy, had mattered. She spent her last years looking through that album, telling us stories about each person, each moment captured on film. She remembered things she thought she'd forgotten. She passed down family history we never knew existed. That album was worth more than all the gold in those Nazi trains, because it gave her back something she thought was lost forever. Proof that her family had lived. After Rachel's death, her family donated the photo album to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. It's now part of their collection, displayed alongside millions of other artifacts that testify to lives lived and lost. But they kept one photograph for themselves. A picture of Rachel as a child, sitting between her parents, all 3, smiling at the camera. Taken in Warsaw in 1937. Found in a freight car in a Polish mountain in 2004. Returned to its subject in 2005. And now passed down to her great-great-grandchildren. This is what remains of the treasure trains. Not the gold or the art, but the connections restored, the evidence preserved, the names remembered. Part 14. The Last Guardian. Munich, Germany, 2021. Martin Steiner was 76 years old and had spent his entire life in his grandfather's shadow. Friedrich Steiner's son, Martin's father, had died young in 1963, broken by his father's reputation. Growing up as the son of an SS officer in post-war Germany was difficult enough. Being the son of an SS officer who'd become famous posthumously as both war criminal and reluctant witness was worse. Martin's father had changed the family name in 1948, trying to escape the association. But after Sarah Markowitz's book and the revelations from the Steiner cache, the connection became public knowledge again. Martin had spent years answering for his grandfather's crimes. But in 2021, while clearing out his late mother's apartment, Martin found something unexpected: a small safe deposit box key, along with a letter in his grandmother's handwriting. "Mart, your grandfather gave me this key in 1947, just after his release from Soviet custody. He said he was depositing something in a bank vault for safekeeping, but he wouldn't tell me what. He said that if anything happened to him, I should wait 30 years before opening it. If nothing had changed by then, if no one had found the other caches, if the items hadn't been returned, I should make the contents public. But by 1977, your father was still alive, trying to build a life separate from Friedrich's legacy. I couldn't bear to add to his burden, so I kept the key hidden. I kept it hidden through your father's death, through decades of silence. Now I'm dying, and the choice falls to you. The bank is Hoffman and Sons in Stuttgart. The box number is on the key. I don't know what's inside. Friedrich never told me. Perhaps it's nothing. Perhaps it's one final revelation. Whatever you decide, know this: your grandfather was not a good man. He participated in terrible things, but at the end, he tried to make something right. That doesn't balance the scales. Nothing could, but it means something. With love, your grandmother." The letter was dated 2019, just before her death, but she'd never given him the key. Never mentioned it. Perhaps she'd forgotten, her mind fading in her final years, or perhaps she'd decided the burden was too great to pass on. But now Martin had it. The question was what to do with it. He contacted Sarah Markowitz, who'd become something of the unofficial historian of the Steiner story. She was now in her 70s herself, but still sharp, still curious. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked when he explained the situation. "I think I need to do this alone," Martin said, "but I wanted someone to know In case, I don't know, in case it matters. Everything matters, Sarah replied. Even the things we wish didn't. Martin traveled to Stuttgart in November 2021. The bank, Hoffman & Sons, still existed, now part of a larger financial conglomerate, but maintaining its original name and location. He presented the key and his identification. The manager confirmed that the safe deposit box had been opened regularly by Friedrich Steiner himself until his death in 1948, then sealed with instructions that it could only be opened by designated heirs. Martin was listed as one of 3 potential heirs: himself, his deceased father, and his grandmother. "We've maintained this box for 73 years, the manager said. The rental fees were prepaid through 2050 in gold. In 1947, your grandfather was thorough." Martin was led to a private viewing room. The box, surprisingly large, more of a small trunk, was brought to him. He was left alone. Inside the box, he found 3 things. First, a leather-bound journal, another copy of Steiner's ledgers, but this one included additional notes, personal reflections, and something new: a list of names, not victims, but perpetrators. SS officers who'd participated in the looting operations, businessmen who'd knowingly purchased stolen goods, bank officials who'd facilitated the money laundering, politicians who'd looked the other way. Some of these names were already known, but many weren't. And Steiner had included details, dates, locations, specific transactions, evidence that could still, even 73 years later, lead to legal action or historical correction. Second, a collection of letters written by Steiner between 1945 and 1948, apparently never sent. They were addressed to various people: his son, his wife, Jewish organizations, Allied authorities. Each letter tried to explain, to justify, to confess, to apologize. None seemed adequate even to Steiner himself, based on marginal notes he'd written. Too defensive, missing the point. How do you apologize for the unforgivable? One letter, addressed to whoever finds this, read, "I've spent 3 years trying to write something that explains what I did and why I failed. There is no explanation that doesn't sound like an excuse. There is no why that makes sense. I participated in the theft and murder of innocent people. I knew what I was doing. I chose to do it anyway. I told myself I was just following orders, just doing my job, just surviving in difficult times. These were lies. What I'm leaving in this vault is everything I know about what we did and who did it. Names, dates, locations, methods. It's not enough. Nothing would be enough, but it's what I have. I hope someone uses this information to pursue justice. I hope families find closure. I hope the men who escaped punishment, and many did, are eventually held accountable. But more than that, I hope future generations understand that ordinary people like me can become complicit in extraordinary evil. I wasn't a monster. I was a banker who loved his family, enjoyed music, collected stamps. I was normal. That's what makes it so terrifying. If it happened to me, it can happen to anyone. That's the real warning." Friedrich Steiner, July 2nd, 1948, 2 days before my death. But Steiner hadn't died in July 1948. He died in July 1948. But the note was clearly written in anticipation of death. Perhaps he'd been more ill than anyone knew. Actually, Martin realized, checking his grandmother's records, Friedrich Steiner had died on July 3rd, 1948. This letter was written the day before. The next day, he'd sealed the vault and died hours later of heart failure, according to the death certificate. The third item in the vault was the most surprising: a small wooden box containing jewelry. Not valuable pieces, not stolen masterpieces, simple items. Wedding rings, a child's bracelet, a Star of David pendant. Each piece had a tag with a name and a date. Attached to the box was a note: "These items came into my possession during the war, through channels I'd rather not detail. I should have returned them immediately after the war, but I was a coward. I was afraid that admitting I'd kept anything would destroy the small credibility I'd built with the authorities. I've carried the guilt of this for 3 years. Now I'm dying, and I can't return them myself. So I leave them here, with the request that whoever finds this makes the effort I lacked the courage to make. Each piece has a name attached. Please try to find these people or their families. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I had no right to keep these items, even for a day. Tell them I failed them in every way possible, but that at least I documented what happened to their property. And tell them that at the very end, I remembered their names. Martin sat in that bank vault for 2 hours, reading through everything. Then he carefully repacked it all and took it with him. Part 15. The Final Return. Martin Steiner worked with Sarah Markowitz and the Jewish Restitution Commission to process his grandfather's final cash. The journal with perpetrator names led to several investigations. Some individuals named were already dead, but others were still alive. Very old, but alive. Very old, but alive. Legal proceedings were initiated in Germany, Austria, and Poland. The letters were archived as historical documents, adding to the understanding of how perpetrators rationalized their actions. But the jewelry box required different handling. There were 17 pieces, each tagged with a name. Martin and the research team spent months trying to track down the individuals or their descendants. They found 12. One ring was returned to a woman in Buenos Aires whose grandmother had worn it. The grandmother had survived Auschwitz, but never spoke about what she'd lost. The granddaughter cried when she saw the ring, recognizing it from a single pre-war photograph. A Star of David pendant went to a family in New York. It had belonged to their great-uncle, killed in Treblinka. They'd assumed everything of his had been destroyed. The pendant was engraved on the back. To Daniel on his 13th birthday, may you always remember who you are. A child's bracelet, tiny, with a Hebrew inscription, went to a woman in Tel Aviv. It had been her older sister's. Her sister had died in the Warsaw Ghetto at age 7. The woman, who'd been 3 when her sister died, had no memory of her. The bracelet was the first tangible connection she'd ever had. 5 pieces could not be traced. The families had been completely eliminated, or records were too incomplete to identify descendants. These items were donated to Holocaust museums with documentation of their origin. For the remaining pieces, the research continued. In 2023, Martin Steiner received a phone call from a researcher in Poland. They'd found a possible match for one of the rings, a signet ring with the initials MK and a date, 1920. The researcher had found a death record for a Mordecai Katz, born 1920, died Auschwitz 1944. Mordecai's daughter, Esther, had survived by being in a work camp in a different location. Esther had emigrated to Israel after the war, married, had children. She was still alive, living in Haifa, age 81. Martin traveled to Israel to return the ring in person. Esther answered the door of her small apartment, a tiny woman with white hair and bright eyes. She invited Martin in, offered him tea, treated him with a warmth that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "You're Friedrich Steiner's grandson," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I came to—" "I know why you're here," the researcher called. "You have something that belonged to my father." Martin opened the small box he'd brought. Inside was the signet ring, cleaned and polished, but showing its age. The initials MK gleamed in the afternoon light. Esther picked up the ring with trembling hands. She slipped it onto her thumb, the only finger it would fit. "I was 12 when they took him. The Nazis came to our ghetto, selected the men for transport. My father tried to hide his wedding ring, but they found it. They took everything. I didn't know about this ring. He must have hidden it successfully. Or maybe someone took it after." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry," Martin said. "I'm sorry my grandfather kept this. I'm sorry he didn't return it sooner. I'm sorry for everything." Esther looked at him with an expression that was both sad and kind. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're returning what was taken. That's more than many would do." She paused, turning the ring on her thumb. "Do you know what this date means? 1920? That was my father's bar mitzvah year. This ring was a gift from his parents. He wore it every day for 24 years, until the day they took him. I can't imagine what—" "No, you can't. And that's okay. No one who wasn't there can imagine it. She smiled slightly. But you're here now, giving me back a piece of him. That matters. That's a mitzvah, a good deed. Martin started to cry. He hadn't expected to, but the weight of 3 generations suddenly crushed down on him. His grandfather's crimes, his father's shame, his own guilt by association, by blood, by inherited history. Esther put a wrinkled hand on his. Your grandfather did terrible things. You know that. I know that. But at the end, he tried to remember our names. He tried to document what happened. He tried to save something. It doesn't erase what he did. Nothing could. But it means that somewhere in him, something was still human. How can you be so kind to me? Martin asked. My family participated in yours being murdered because you're not your grandfather. You're a man who traveled across the world to return a ring to an old woman. You're a man who's trying to make right things that went wrong before you were born. That's who you are, not your grandfather's crimes, your own choices. They sat together for an hour, drinking tea, talking about family, about history, about how the sins of the past echo through generations, but don't have to define them. When Martin left, Esther insisted on giving him something, a photograph of her father, taken in 1938, where he was clearly wearing the ring. Martin had just returned. So you can remember him, Esther said, not as a victim, as a person. Mordecai Katz, who loved music and told terrible jokes, and wore this ring every day because it reminded him of his parents' love. That photograph sits on Martin Steiner's desk now, a reminder that the treasure trains weren't really about gold or art. They were about people, people who owned things, made things, cherished things, people who were murdered and whose property was stolen, and people who, decades later, are still trying to return what was taken. Conclusion: what was really lost? Berlin, Germany. Present day. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin consists of 2,711 concrete slabs arranged in a grid pattern. Walking through it, you feel the magnitude, the overwhelming, crushing number of people who died. 6 million Jews, millions more Romani, disabled people, political prisoners, LGBT individuals, Slavs deemed undesirable. But numbers, even staggering numbers, can become abstract. They're too large to comprehend. The human mind can't really grasp the difference between 1 million deaths and 6 million deaths. Both are just too many. That's why the treasure trains matter. Not because of the monetary value, though billions of dollars is staggering by any measure. Not because of the art, though masterpieces were lost and some were recovered. The treasure trains matter because they're concrete, specific. A ring engraved with Miriam and Jacob's names. A painting that hung in a real apartment where real people live. A photo album documenting actual faces, actual moments, actual lives. Every item in those trains represented a person who'd worked to earn money to buy that ring, a person who'd chosen that painting because it spoke to them, a person who'd taken those photographs because they wanted to remember happy moments. The Nazis didn't just kill 6 million Jews. They killed 6 million individuals, each with their own story, their own dreams, their own unique existence. And they tried to erase every trace of those individuals, melting down their wedding rings into anonymous bars of gold, burning their photographs, stealing their art, and pretending it had always belonged to the right. The treasure trains were supposed to ensure that erasure was complete. The wealth would fund the Nazi state. The art would glorify Nazi culture. The personal effects would be destroyed or forgotten. It would be as if these people had never existed. But Friedrich Steiner, Klaus Richter, and others like them ensured that didn't happen complete by keeping records, by preserving items, by hiding caches that could someday be found. They left evidence. Evidence that these people existed, evidence that their property was stolen, evidence that the Holocaust wasn't just an abstract atrocity, but a concrete, documented crime against millions of individuals. That evidence continues to surface. In 2022, A painting by Gustav Klimt was discovered in a museum in Vienna, where it had been mislabeled for 70 years. Research proved it had been looted from a Jewish collector in 1938. It was returned to the collector's heirs. In 2023, a shoebox full of documents was found in a demolished building in Munich. Among the papers, confiscation records from 1943 documenting the seizure of property from Jewish families in the Netherlands. These records allowed researchers to connect stolen items to specific families for the first time. These discoveries will continue. As buildings are demolished, as archives are digitized, as descendants go through their grandparents' effects, more evidence emerges. More pieces of the puzzle come together. More names are recovered from oblivion. The treasure trains, in the end, weren't just about what the Nazis stole. They were about what couldn't be stolen. Memory, identity, proof of existence. Friedrich Steiner's final ledger, now preserved in multiple archives around the world, ends with a single line that he added in 1948, just before sealing his last deposit box. They tried to erase these people from history. This document proves they failed. The names remain. Miriam and Jakob, whose rings were engraved with love. The Rothschild family, whose art collection was scattered across Europe. Mordecai Katz, whose signet ring bore the date of his bar mitzvah. Rachel Rosenblum's family, whose photo album documented ordinary joy in Warsaw. Daniel, who received a Star of David pendant for his 13th birthday. And millions more, whose names we'll never know, whose property was never recovered, whose existence is documented only in Nazi records of their murder. The trains carried billions in treasure, but what they really carried, what Friedrich Steiner tried to preserve, and what people are still working to return, was something more valuable than gold. They carried proof that these people were here, that they mattered, that they loved and were loved, that they can't be erased, can't be forgotten, can't be reduced to statistics. The treasure trains have been found, the caches have been opened, the gold has been distributed, the art has been returned, but the most important treasure, the names, the stories, the evidence that these people existed, that's still being recovered, still being documented, still being shared. And that work will continue as long as anyone remembers to look, as long as anyone asks, who were they? What did they lose? Can anything be returned? The answer is yes. Not everything, not even most things, but something. And in that something, in those returned rings and photographs and paintings, in those documented names and preserved memories, there is a kind of redemption, not for the perpetrators. They deserved no redemption, but for the victims. Proof that they were not forgotten, that their lives had meaning, that their property, their identity, their very existence could not be completely erased by hate. The Nazi treasure trains vanished into the mountains in May 1945, but what they carry, the evidence, the names, the memories, that never disappeared. And now, piece by piece, item by item, name by name, it's coming home.